The Force had always moved in currents that defied simple explanation, but it had never screamed. On the edge of the Outer Rim, far beyond stable hyperspace lanes, that scream tore through reality itself. Star maps fractured. Navicomputers froze mid-calculation. Hyperspace routes that had existed for millennia collapsed into spiraling impossibilities, while new ones formed without warning, bleeding starlight like open wounds. Pilots felt it first as nausea, then terror, then silence as entire squadrons vanished between one heartbeat and the next. No explosion marked the moment. No fireball or supernova announced the catastrophe. The galaxy simply shifted, as if something unimaginably vast had forced its way into a space that was never meant to contain it. On a lonely Imperial listening post orbiting a dead moon, technicians stared at their consoles in disbelief as sensor returns layered over one another like overlapping ghosts. Energy signatures appeared that matched no known spectrum. Some radiated power comparable to capital ships without mass. Others pulsed with rhythms that mimicked life yet bore no biological markers. The station's commander ordered a full diagnostic, then a shutdown, then a reboot, convinced this had to be sabotage or equipment failure. It was neither. Outside the viewport, the stars themselves seemed wrong. Constellations subtly rearranged, as if the galaxy had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. Across the galaxy on Coruscant, deep beneath layers of durasteel and ancient stone, Emperor Palpatine paused mid-step in his private sanctum. The Force surged around him in a way he had never felt before, not even during the fall of the Jedi Order. This was not the cold clarity of the dark side, nor the familiar resistance of the light. This was pressure, invasion. It felt as though countless presences were pressing inward, grinding against the Force like incompatible gears. For the first time in decades, the Sith Lord did not smile. He closed his eyes, extending his awareness outward, and what he sensed made even his mastery feel small. The Force did not recognize what was happening. It was reacting, not commanding, and that terrified him. The collapse did not arrive evenly. It came in ruptures, localized failures of reality that punched through space like wounds. Near the mid-rim, a shattered flotilla of unknown design emerged from nothing, their hulls bearing scars that did not match blaster fire or turbolasers. On a desert world that was not Tatooine, but felt eerily similar, a lone figure fell from a sky without a ship, slamming into the sand hard enough to carve a crater. He rose moments later, disoriented but alive, staring at twin suns that were not the ones he knew. Elsewhere, something vast and luminous phased halfway into real space before recoiling, leaving behind a gravitational echo that bent light and tore apart a moon surface. Each event was different, but all shared one truth. These beings did not belong, and the galaxy knew it. The Force responded the only way it could. Vergences ignited without warning. Ancient Jedi ruins that had been dormant for centuries began to hum with latent power. Sith artifacts whispered louder, feeding on the chaos. On forgotten worlds, Force-sensitive cultists dropped to their knees, convinced prophecy was finally unfolding. Yet the Force itself felt strained, stretched thin across realities it had never touched before. It was no longer the sole narrative thread binding existence together. Other systems of power, other cosmic laws, were bleeding in, refusing to submit, refusing to translate cleanly. Balance, long defined by light and dark, began to fracture into something far more complex. For those caught in the initial shockwaves, survival came before understanding. A smuggler crew narrowly escaped hyperspace collapse only to find themselves emerging above a planet that should not exist, its continents shaped in impossible geometries. Bounty hunters quickly learned that some of the newcomers bled differently, fought differently, and died far harder than any quarry the guild had prepared them for. The criminal underworld adapted first, as it always did, seeing profit in confusion. Information brokers traded rumors of godlike warriors and living weapons. Slavers hunted the disoriented, betting that even impossible beings could be broken. In the shadows, entire syndicates rose and fell within days, unable to predict which rules still applied. The Jedi, scattered and hunted, felt the disturbance like a knife in the chest. Those who survived Order 66 had learned to keep their presence hidden, to move lightly through the Force like ghosts. Now concealment became harder. The Force itself was turbulent, unpredictable, flaring in ways that exposed them no matter how carefully they suppressed their power. Some felt hope, sensing that the Emperor's absolute control might finally be challenged by forces he could not foresee. Others felt dread, realizing that if the galaxy itself was unraveling, survival might demand compromises the old order had never allowed. Inquisitors were dispatched almost immediately. Where the Emperor felt uncertainty, he demanded answers. These agents of the dark side tracked anomalies not by logic, but by pain, following the scars the collapse left in the Force. On one backwater world, an Inquisitor arrived to find an entire settlement leveled, not by orbital bombardment, but by a single battle that had bent gravity, scorched the air, and left no recognizable weapon signatures. On another, stormtroopers engaged a lone figure who shrugged off blaster fire with contemptuous ease, cutting through plastoid armor without a lightsaber or blade. Reports flooded Imperial intelligence, each more contradictory than the last, yet all pointing to the same conclusion. The Empire no longer monopolized power. Among the displaced, confusion reigned. Some retained memories of worlds that no longer existed, of skies with unfamiliar colors, and histories that suddenly had no anchor. Others felt something worse, a creeping sense that parts of their abilities did not function as they once had, as though the galaxy resisted them on a fundamental level. Energy failed to circulate cleanly. Powers that once answered instinctively now required focus, adaptation, experimentation. The Star Wars galaxy was not empty space. It was alive with the Force, and it did not yield easily to foreign laws. Those who adapted quickly survived. Those who assumed dominance died. The collapse was not simply physical. It was philosophical. The Jedi believed the Force bound all life, yet now life arrived that did not originate within it. The Sith believed power was singular and conquerable, yet they faced entities that did not recognize their hierarchy. Smugglers, soldiers, and senators alike confronted the same question in different forms. If destiny itself could be overwritten by a multiversal failure, what did loyalty, prophecy, or balance even mean? The galaxy had always been vast, but now it felt crowded with ideas that refused to align. On the fringes of known space, a massive structure formed where nothing had existed before, a slow convergence of light and darkness, matter and void. Ships that approached too closely reported overlapping starfields, echoes of worlds stacked atop one another like reflections in shattered glass. Some heard voices that were not Sith whispers nor Jedi guidance, but something else entirely, narrating histories that had never occurred in this reality. This nexus did not attack. It waited. And in that waiting, it exerted a pull that could be felt across the galaxy, like the promise of answers or the threat of annihilation. As panic spread, so did stories. Cantinas buzzed with rumors of heroes from other realities fighting entire battalions alone. Others spoke of monsters wearing the faces of gods. Some claimed the Force was evolving, others that it was dying. Amid the fear, one truth slowly became clear to anyone paying attention. This was not a temporary anomaly. The multiverse had not brushed past the Star Wars galaxy. It had collapsed into it. There would be no simple reversal, no button to press, no ritual to undo what had been done. Whatever survived this convergence would define the future of reality itself. And this was only the beginning. The first fractures had revealed the scale of the disaster, but not its intent. The galaxy had become the battlefield for incompatible truths, and every faction, every survivor, every displaced soul would soon be forced to choose how they responded. Adapt, dominate, hide, or break. As the Force trembled under the weight of infinite possibilities, the question was no longer who would win. It was whether a single galaxy could contain so many realities without tearing itself apart completely. If you want to see more universe-shattering, what-if stories where impossible characters and entire realities collide with Star Wars, make sure to subscribe to the channel and stay with us. because what comes next will push this galaxy far beyond anything it has ever faced before. The stars did not realign. The screaming did not stop. Somewhere in the deep dark between systems, something ancient, patient, and aware began to move, drawn by the promise of a galaxy that could finally hold everything. And as the Force struggled to redefine itself, destiny loosened its grip, leaving the future terrifyingly open. The galaxy did not descend into chaos all at once. It fractured along familiar fault lines, stress finding weakness in politics, belief, and power. While worlds reeled from impossible arrivals and distorted skies, the institutions that had once defined order reacted according to their nature, and in doing so revealed how unprepared they truly were for a reality that no longer obeyed their rules. On Coruscant, the Imperial Senate chamber stood silent, not because of reverence, but because no one knew what to say. Holographic displays flickered with overlapping star charts, entire regions of space blinking in and out of existence, as if undecided. Senators argued in hushed tones, no longer posturing for influence, but scrambling to understand whether their systems still existed. Some worlds reported multiple versions of themselves occupying the same orbital space, phased just enough to avoid immediate collision, their skies filled with ghostly reflections of cities that should not be there. Refugees poured in through hyperspace lanes that changed daily, carrying stories so contradictory they sounded like madness. Yet the data supported them. Reality itself had become unreliable. The Emperor did not attend. He did not need to. Through the Force, Palpatine watched every reaction, every fear, every desperate grasp for certainty. The collapse offended him on a level deeper than political inconvenience. It represented a challenge to the Sith's core belief that power could be understood, mastered, and wielded absolutely. These intrusions were not simply strong. They were alien to the Force's established hierarchy. Some radiated nothing at all, yet bent causality around them. Others burned with energies that clashed violently with Force currents, causing localized dead zones where Jedi and Sith alike found their abilities dulled or erratic. The dark side whispered that this was an opportunity. The Sith way had always thrived on upheaval. But even Palpatine recognized the danger of losing control over the very medium through which he ruled. Orders were issued quietly and without debate. The Inquisitorius would prioritize intelligence gathering over extermination. Anything that could destabilize the Emperor's supremacy would be studied, catalogued, and, if possible, weaponized. Imperial Science Division was given unprecedented authority, black sites springing up across the Outer Rim to detain beings pulled from collapsed realities. Some cooperated. Others escaped in ways that left entire facilities erased, not destroyed but undone, as if they had never existed. These failures were buried under layers of classified reports, yet fear spread through the ranks. Stormtroopers trained to face blasters and lightsabers found themselves confronting foes who moved faster than perception, shrugged off death, or rewrote the battlefield by their presence alone. Far from Coruscant spires, the Jedi survivors felt the weight of the collapse differently. The Force no longer flowed with the clarity it once had. Meditation brought not peace, but noise, echoes of other realities brushing against their awareness. Some Jedi experienced visions that contradicted one another, futures branching endlessly without convergence. For an order built on foresight and balance, this uncertainty was devastating. Masters who had once trusted the Force implicitly now questioned whether it still spoke with a single voice. To some, the newcomers felt like heresy incarnate, proof that the Jedi had misunderstood the universe all along. To others, they represented living contradictions that demanded humility rather than dogma. Ahsoka Tano, moving between shadowed worlds under false identities, encountered one such contradiction firsthand. On a moon scarred by recent impact, she witnessed a lone displaced warrior fend off a pirate gang with techniques that mirrored the Force yet drew from something else entirely. The movements were disciplined, precise, but the energy did not resonate the way the Force did. Watching from concealment, Ahsoka felt both familiarity and estrangement, as though she were seeing a reflection that refused to align. When the battle ended and the warrior fled rather than claim victory, she realized something unsettling. This being was not seeking dominance or alignment. They were surviving, adapting, learning the rules of a galaxy that resisted them. That adaptability, more than raw power, worried her. The criminal underworld flourished in the confusion. Huts expanded their territories by offering sanctuary to the displaced, not out of compassion but calculation. Exotic beings fetched extraordinary prices, especially those rumored to possess abilities that defied force suppression collars or energy dampeners. Bounty hunters became scouts as much as killers, mapping anomalies and selling the information to the highest bidder. Some refused contracts outright after facing targets that nearly killed them without effort. Others embraced the risk, drawn by the promise of legend and credits beyond imagination. Entire syndicates collapsed overnight when a single newcomer dismantled their operations without understanding the significance of what they were destroying. Meanwhile, neutral systems attempted diplomacy with the unknown. On a mid-rim trade world, a council convened representatives from 3 realities that now shared the same orbit, each insisting their laws and histories were the correct ones. Negotiations broke down when basic concepts like sovereignty and causality failed to translate. One delegate aged decades during a single session, while another remained unchanged, immune to time's passage. Violence followed, not out of malice, but misunderstanding. And by the time order was restored, the planet itself had begun to destabilize, its core reacting violently to conflicting physical constants. Evacuation was ordered too late. The world folded in on itself, collapsing into a singularity that left behind nothing but debris and a warning written in silence. Across the galaxy, scholars and mystics attempted to make sense of it all. Ancient Jedi holocrons flickered, their recorded masters struggling to answer questions they were never designed to address. Sith artifacts screamed with excitement, sensing power beyond tradition, yet unable to fully consume it. Some force-sensitive cultists proclaimed the collapse as divine judgment, others as ascension. A few were right in ways they did not understand. The force was not disappearing. It was being crowded, pressured by the presence of systems that did not rely on midi-chlorians or light and dark dichotomies. It adapted, sometimes violently. New vergences formed spontaneously, places where foreign energies and the force overlapped, creating unstable yet potent nexuses. Whoever controlled these sites gained access to something unprecedented. Whoever failed to respect them vanished. The Rebel Alliance, fragmented and cautious, saw both hope and peril. The Empire's attention was divided, its resources stretched thin by threats it could not easily crush. Some rebel cells made contact with displaced beings who shared their hatred of tyranny, forging uneasy alliances based on mutual survival rather than ideology. Others learned the hard way that not every enemy of the Empire was a friend. One cell was annihilated when a powerful outsider, mistaking them for local enforcers, retaliated with overwhelming force. The lesson was brutal and immediate. Intent no longer mattered as much as understanding, and misunderstanding had become lethal. The Mandalorians, ever pragmatic, adapted faster than most. Clans tested their Beskar against unfamiliar weapons and energies, documenting what held and what failed. Some saw the collapse as a challenge worthy of song, a proving ground against warriors from infinite traditions. Others feared dilution of their culture in a galaxy where legends arrived fully formed. A few ambitious leaders proposed expansion beyond known space, seeking to stake Mandalorian claim in this new, layered reality. Skirmishes erupted not for ideology, but for proof of superiority, and the tales that spread from these battles only deepened the mythic aura surrounding the newcomers. Yet beneath every reaction lay the same unease. The collapse had no visible endpoint. Each day brought new arrivals, new distortions, new evidence that the galaxy was becoming something else entirely. The Force no longer guided events with subtle inevitability. Chance played a greater role. Free will felt amplified, as though destiny itself had loosened its grip. For some, this was liberation. For others, it was terror. without the comforting illusion that the galaxy followed a coherent path. Every choice carried unprecedented weight. In the deep core, Palpatine began preparations he had never intended to use so soon. Ancient Sith knowledge spoke of consuming realities, not merging with them. If the multiverse insisted on collapsing into his domain, then he would reshape it to his design. But even as he planned, he felt resistance, not from the Jedi or the rebels, but from the galaxy itself. The Force pushed back not with moral judgment, but survival instinct. Too much strain, and everything would tear apart. The second truth of the collapse became undeniable. This was not merely an invasion of beings. It was an invasion of philosophies, of ways reality could function. No single faction, no matter how powerful, could dictate the outcome alone. The Star Wars galaxy was no longer the center of its own story. It had become the crossroads of existence, and every step taken from this point forward would echo across more than one reality. The first true war of the collapsed galaxy did not begin with a declaration. It began with a misunderstanding that spiraled beyond control, proving that when realities collided, intent mattered far less than consequence. On the edge of the mid-rim, near a hyperspace corridor that now fractured and reformed without warning, an Imperial task force encountered something it could not categorize, intimidate, or immediately destroy. The anomaly appeared as a vast structure suspended in space, neither ship nor station, its geometry constantly shifting, as though undecided about its own shape. Imperial scanners returned contradictory readings. At one moment it registered as solid mass larger than a star destroyer, the next as an energy phenomenon with no physical anchor. Inside, thousands of life signs pulsed, but none aligned with known biological templates. The force around it felt distorted, not dark, not light, but stretched thin, like fabric pulled too tight. Grand Admiral Thrawn was summoned. Unlike many within the Imperial hierarchy, Thrawn did not react with fear or outrage. He observed. He requested data, art, intercepted communications, fragments of visual feeds captured by long-range probes. Patterns emerged where others saw chaos. The structure was not invading. It was stabilizing itself, anchoring to this reality by adapting to it in real time. That alone made it dangerous. Adaptation implied learning, and learning implied intent. The first contact team never returned. A shuttle was dispatched with orders to establish communication and assess threat level. Its transmission cut out moments after docking, replaced by a flood of data that overloaded Imperial systems across 3 ships. Visual logs later recovered showed the boarding party walking through corridors that rearranged themselves with every step, walls shifting like living organisms. Figures emerged from the structure's interior, humanoid yet unfamiliar, their movements synchronized as if governed by a shared consciousness. Blaster fire proved ineffective, dispersing energy harmlessly through their forms. The last image before the feed ended showed an Imperial officer frozen mid-command, his body fracturing into luminous shards that scattered and vanished. The Empire responded as it always did, with overwhelming force. Turbolasers lit the void, hammering the structure from multiple vectors. For a moment, it seemed to work. Portions of the anomaly destabilized, collapsing into brilliant implosions. Then it adapted. Energy absorbed from the barrage redistributed across its surface, hardening sections of its form, redirecting destructive force back into Imperial space. A Star Destroyer's shields failed without warning. Its hull twisted not from impact, but from reality itself bending inward. The ship folded, snapped, and vanished, leaving behind nothing but silence. Across the galaxy, Force-sensitive beings felt the moment like a scream. Jedi, in hiding, dropped to their knees, overwhelmed by a surge of unfamiliar sensation, not pain but displacement, as if the Force had momentarily forgotten where they belonged. Sith acolytes reeled, their dark meditations disrupted by something that did not fear them, did not acknowledge them, did not even register them as relevant. The clash was not just physical, it was metaphysical. 2 systems of existence, colliding violently in a space neither fully understood. Thrawn ordered a retreat. This decision baffled his subordinates. The Empire did not retreat. Yet Thrawn recognized what others did not. The structure was not an enemy in the conventional sense. It was a node, a convergence point where multiple realities overlapped. Destroying it outright might tear the hyperspace corridor itself apart, isolating entire sectors or collapsing them into nothing. Worse, it might provoke retaliation from forces the Empire was not prepared to face. Within hours, rumors spread. Some claimed the anomaly was a refugee ark from a dead universe. Others whispered it was a weapon fleeing its creators. Still others believed it was a god. The Rebel Alliance took notice when Imperial forces withdrew without victory. Recon teams were dispatched, operating independently of one another, each cell hoping to learn something useful before the Empire returned. One such team, led by a veteran pilot who had survived encounters with both Vader and the Inquisitors, made contact with a survivor drifting near the anomaly's perimeter. The being was barely alive, humanoid in shape but composed of layered energy and matter that shimmered unpredictably. The survivor communicated through fractured images projected directly into the minds of those nearby. What they showed was not an invasion plan, but a catastrophe. Their universe had not collapsed into this one by choice. It had been consumed by a cascading failure, a chain reaction triggered when too many realities brushed against one another. The structure was a lifeboat, carrying what remained of countless worlds fused together out of desperation. The rebels faced a choice they were unprepared for. Helping the survivor meant drawing attention. Ignoring them meant abandoning beings who had already lost everything. They chose to help, transmitting the data they received to Alliance leadership. That decision saved lives, but it also painted a target on their backs. Imperial intelligence intercepted fragments of the transmission. Thrawn now understood something critical. This was not a singular event. It was a symptom. More such nodes would appear, and each one would destabilize the galaxy further. Elsewhere, the Jedi survivors convened in secret. Scattered across worlds and bound only by shared experience, they gathered through encrypted channels and risky journeys. Among them were former knights, Padawans who had never completed their training, and Force sensitives who had rejected the Order long before its fall. The collapse forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Jedi philosophy, built around balance within a single cosmic system, was inadequate for a multiversal convergence. Debate turned heated. Some argued the newcomers must be guided, taught to coexist with the Force. Others believed interference would only worsen the strain. A minority proposed something radical: severance. If the multiverse had collapsed into one galaxy, perhaps it could be unraveled. Realities carefully separated before total annihilation occurred. The Force, they theorized, might be used not as a weapon, but as a stitching mechanism, reinforcing the seams between universes rather than letting them tear. The problem was scale. Such an undertaking would require power and knowledge beyond anything the surviving Jedi possessed. That knowledge existed, however, in places they had been taught to avoid. Sith holocrons, ancient ruins predating the Republic, virgin sites now amplified by foreign energies. The Jedi faced a moral dilemma with no clean answer. To save the galaxy, they might have to embrace techniques rooted in domination and control. The collapse did not care about their code. Reality would not pause while they debated purity. As factions maneuvered, individuals made choices that would ripple outward. On a lawless frontier world, a warrior from another universe carved out a sanctuary for the displaced, enforcing peace through sheer presence. No banners were flown, no allegiance declared. Refugees gathered regardless of origin, drawn by the promise of safety. The Empire labeled it a threat. The rebels debated alliance. The Jedi sensed something unusual. This individual did not disrupt the Force. They harmonized with it, despite not originating from it. That alone challenged centuries of belief. On Nar Shaddaa, criminal syndicates attempted to enslave beings whose powers bent probability itself. The resulting massacre erased entire districts, reshaping the moon's underworld overnight. Credit systems collapsed as wealth became meaningless against existential survival. Information became the true currency, and those who controlled it wielded more power than fleets. Meanwhile, the Force continued to change. Divergences expanded unpredictably. Some granted unprecedented clarity, allowing Force users to perceive multiple timelines simultaneously. Others created dead zones where the Force went silent, leaving Jedi and Sith alike disoriented and vulnerable. Non-Force beings sometimes thrived in these areas, their abilities unaffected, granting them unexpected advantage. The galaxy's old hierarchies eroded with every passing day. Palpatine watched all of this with a mixture of fascination and fury. The collapse threatened his long game, yet it also offered something he had always sought: apotheosis. If the Force was adapting, if reality itself was becoming malleable, then perhaps he could ascend beyond a single universe's limitations. His experiments grew more aggressive. Entire populations were sacrificed in controlled ruptures, attempts to force reality into revealing its underlying structure. Some experiments failed catastrophically. Others succeeded in ways even he did not fully anticipate. The cost was staggering. Planets destabilized, star systems vanished, hyperspace routes became death traps. Yet through the destruction, patterns emerged. The collapse was accelerating, not linearly, but exponentially. Every attempt to exploit it hastened its spread. Every act of restraint delayed it, but could not stop it entirely. The galaxy stood at a crossroads. Adapt and transform into something new, or fracture beyond recovery. The first war had shown what unthinking aggression would bring. The next conflict would be different. It would be deliberate, ideological, fought not just with weapons, but with decisions about what kind of reality deserved to survive. And somewhere within the chaos, forces older than the Force itself stirred, drawn by the convergence, watching as the Star Wars galaxy unknowingly prepared to become the fulcrum upon which existence would turn. The galaxy did not have time to recover from its first collision before the second wave began. Where the initial anomaly had been singular and shocking, this next phase was insidious, unfolding across dozens of systems in ways that felt almost deliberate. Space itself grew unreliable. Hyperspace lanes that had been charted for millennia twisted into unpredictable spirals, depositing ships light years from their intended destinations, or trapping them in liminal corridors where time passed differently. Entire convoys vanished, not destroyed, but misplaced, reappearing weeks later with crews aged years beyond what their chronometers recorded. The Jedi survivors felt it first. Meditation became dangerous. Reaching too deeply into the Force risked touching something vast and alien, presences that did not answer, did not resist, but observed with unsettling patience. Some Jedi reported visions that were not of the future, but of other realities layered atop their own, entire histories playing out in parallel. Others found their abilities fluctuating wildly. Telekinesis became effortless one moment and impossible the next. Precognition fractured, offering branching outcomes without guidance as to which was true. Fear crept in, not of the Sith, but of irrelevance. The Force had always been the organizing principle of the galaxy. Now it was only one voice among many. In certain regions, foreign power systems asserted themselves with terrifying clarity. A mercenary band encountered a lone combatant who manipulated space through sheer will, folding blaster fire back upon its source without touching the Force at all. On a desolate moon, settlers worshipped a being who reshaped matter through spoken language, its words altering physics as easily as commands altered droids. The galaxy was no longer unified by a single metaphysical rule set. The Empire moved swiftly to contain what it could. Thrawn proposed a radical restructuring of Imperial strategy. Instead of attempting to dominate every anomaly, he advocated for classification and selective engagement. Some convergences were too volatile to exploit and should be quarantined. Others, stable enough to study, could yield technologies or insights that would grant the Empire a decisive edge. This approach met resistance from traditionalist Moffs who saw any hesitation as weakness, But Palpatine intervened personally, endorsing Thrawn's plan with thinly veiled interest. Behind closed doors, the Emperor pursued his own path. He had discovered something buried beneath the chaos, a resonance that pulsed beneath every convergence point. A pattern. It suggested the multiverse had not collapsed randomly. Something had pulled it inward, drawing realities together like gravity wells merging. Palpatine believed he could locate the source. If he could control it, he would not merely rule the galaxy. He would define existence itself. The rebels faced a different struggle. Their cause, once clear and morally defined, grew complicated as refugees poured in from fractured realities. Some arrived with advanced weapons capable of annihilating Imperial battalions in seconds. Others brought ideologies that clashed sharply with the Alliance's ideals, valuing order over freedom or survival over compassion. Mon Mothma's councils grew tense as commanders argued whether victory justified compromise. Could the rebellion afford to turn away allies simply because they did not share its values? Or would accepting them erode the very principles the Alliance was built upon? A critical fracture formed within the rebel leadership. One faction believed the collapse was an opportunity. With enough power, the Empire could be overthrown decisively, ending the war quickly. Another warned that escalating the conflict would only accelerate the galaxy's destabilization. Every battle, every superweapon deployed, sent ripples through an already fragile reality. The rebels had always fought asymmetrically, minimizing collateral damage. Now even small skirmishes risked tearing holes in space-time itself. Independent worlds responded in unpredictable ways. Some fortified their borders, shutting down hyperspace access entirely and relying on sublight travel, choosing isolation over annihilation. Others embraced the chaos, forming coalitions with off-world entities whose powers made conventional defense obsolete. Mandalorian clans adapted rapidly, incorporating foreign materials into Beskar alloys, crafting armor resistant not just to lightsabers, but to energies unknown to the galaxy days earlier. Their creed evolved, shifting from honor in battle to survival through adaptation. Criminal syndicates thrived. Where governments hesitated, smugglers moved. Black markets exploded with artifacts pulled from dying universes, devices that defied replication but promised immense power. Hutts brokered deals between realities, charging fortunes for passage through unstable corridors only they dared navigate. Entire wars were fought in secret over access to safe routes, their outcomes reshaping the underworld faster than any imperial decree. The Jedi debate reached a breaking point. A covert expedition was launched to an ancient Sith world long erased from official records, its location revealed only because the collapse had partially restored it to existence. There, beneath ruins humming with dark energy, the Jedi sought knowledge they had sworn never to touch. Holocrons reacted violently to their presence, some shattering outright, others unlocking memories not meant for mortal minds. They learned of rituals designed to bind realities together, to force coherence through domination. The Sith had once sought to reshape the cosmos itself, believing balance was weakness. The Jedi recoiled from the implications, yet they could not ignore the effectiveness of the methods described. Using such techniques risked corruption, but doing nothing risked extinction. The Force, as they understood it, favored balance, but balance between what? Light and dark assumed a single framework. Now there were countless frameworks colliding, each with its own laws. The Jedi faced an impossible question. Was their duty to preserve the Force or to preserve life, even if that meant redefining the Force itself? Meanwhile, the convergent structures began to change. No longer passive, some nodes started emitting signals, broadcasts that cut across frequencies and dimensions. They were not calls for help. They were coordination attempts. Separate anomalies began aligning, adjusting their positions relative to one another, forming vast geometric patterns visible even to the naked eye. Astrophysicists realized with growing horror that these formations mirrored theoretical constructs, describing multiversal stabilization through collapse, not separation. The structures were building something. No one knew what form it would take, only that once complete, the galaxy would never be the same. Some believed it would end the chaos by merging all realities into a single, stable continuum. Others feared it would compress existence into a brittle shell, vulnerable to total annihilation. And a few, those who listened too closely to the whispers bleeding through the Force, suspected the outcome would favor whatever intelligence orchestrated the convergence. The first direct confrontation between ideologies came sooner than expected. A Republic remnant task force, acting independently, attempted to dismantle a convergence node near a populated system, believing preemptive action necessary. Jedi advisors urged caution. They were overruled. The detonation that followed did not destroy the node. It destabilized it. Reality around the system folded inward, compressing space until planets collided without ever touching. Billions vanished in seconds. The Force recoiled violently, creating a shockwave felt across half the galaxy. Silence followed. Then understanding. The collapse could not be bombed away. It could not be ignored. Every faction now knew that reckless action would doom them all. Yet restraint required trust, and trust was in shorter supply than ever. The galaxy stood divided, armed, and terrified, staring into a future where survival depended not on strength alone, but on the willingness to evolve beyond everything it believed itself to be. In the aftermath of the failed assault on the convergence node, the galaxy entered a period of uneasy stillness that felt more threatening than open war. The systems that had once burned with constant conflict now hesitated, fleets holding position at the edges of hyperspace lanes that no longer behaved predictably. Commanders across the galaxy waited for orders that did not come, aware that a single miscalculation could unravel entire star systems. The collapse had forced every faction to confront a reality more terrifying than defeat, the possibility that victory itself might be fatal. Scientific institutions, long marginalized by military necessity, suddenly found themselves at the center of galactic survival. Imperial research divisions, rebel think tanks, and independent academies all reached the same conclusion through different methodologies. The convergence was accelerating. The multiverse was not stabilizing on its own. Each collision increased the probability of further collapses, creating a cascading effect that would eventually compress all realities into a singular point of failure. Whether that endpoint meant rebirth or oblivion remained unknown, but the timeline was no longer theoretical. Estimates ranged from decades to mere years. The Empire attempted to seize control of this research effort. Imperial envoys arrived unannounced at neutral institutions, offering protection in exchange for data. Those who refused found their funding frozen, their hyperspace access revoked, or their leadership quietly replaced. The Emperor framed the initiative as necessary coordination, but the message was clear. Knowledge was power, and the Empire would not allow rivals to shape the future unchecked. Thrawn oversaw the integration of foreign sciences into imperial doctrine, ensuring that each discovery was cataloged, classified, and weaponized if possible. Yet even the Empire faced limits. Some forms of knowledge resisted assimilation. Certain convergence phenomena could not be replicated in controlled environments. Attempts to isolate fragments of collapsing realities often resulted in catastrophic feedback, annihilating entire research stations. Engineers discovered that technologies from other universes did not always obey Star Wars physics when removed from their native context. Power sources destabilized, materials decayed, and systems failed in unpredictable ways. The multiverse had rules, but they were not universal. The Jedi Order, diminished but not extinct, adopted a different approach. Rather than dissect the collapse, they sought to listen to it. Meditation circles were established in remote systems where the Force still flowed relatively undisturbed. There, Jedi Masters and Padawans alike attempted to perceive the convergence not as a threat, but as a process. Patterns began to emerge. The Force reacted not only to events, but to intent. Regions where cooperation emerged showed slower destabilization. Areas dominated by conquest and exploitation fractured more violently. This realization unsettled many within the Order. It suggested the collapse was not merely mechanical, but responsive, that consciousness itself played a role in shaping the outcome. If true, then the galaxy's future would not be decided solely by technology or power, but by collective choice. The Jedi debated whether this insight should be shared, revealing it could inspire unity, but it could also be manipulated. The Sith, if they learned the truth, would see opportunity in shaping intent through fear and domination. The Rebel Alliance fractured further under the weight of these revelations. Field commanders operating near convergence zones reported anomalous effects during combat. Units fighting defensively experienced fewer spatial distortions than those pursuing aggressive offensives. Morale, belief, even hope appeared to influence local stability. Some leaders argued this validated the Alliance's core philosophy. Others dismissed it as coincidence, warning against basing strategy on unprovable metaphysics. Tensions escalated as resources dwindled and refugees overwhelmed logistics. A schism formed. One faction within the rebels advocated open cooperation with neutral and even imperial systems, proposing temporary truces to address the collapse collectively. Another viewed this as betrayal, insisting the Empire would exploit any pause to consolidate power. Skirmishes erupted not only with imperial forces, but between rebel cells themselves, each claiming to act in the galaxy's best interest. Unity, once their greatest strength, eroded under existential pressure. Beyond the reach of governments, new movements emerged. Entire communities formed around convergence zones, treating them not as disasters, but as gateways. Pilgrims traveled light years to witness realities overlapping, convinced the collapse represented transcendence rather than destruction. Some returned changed, claiming visions of merged histories and shared consciousness. Others did not return at all. The Jedi monitored these groups closely, wary of cult-like devotion to forces they barely understood. One such group attracted particular concern. They called themselves the Harmonists. Unlike other cults, they did not worship a single entity. Instead, they believed the multiverse collapse was a corrective event, eliminating flawed realities to create a perfected whole. Their doctrine rejected resistance entirely. They sabotaged evacuation efforts near convergence zones, arguing survival interfered with the natural order. Evidence suggested they were not acting alone. Their resources were too vast, their coordination too precise. Investigations traced their influence back to multiple realities. The Harmonists appeared to be a cross-universal phenomenon, existing in countless forms across collapsing worlds. Each iteration believed itself unique, yet they shared identical symbols, language structures, and goals. The implication was chilling. Some intelligence, or alignment of intelligences, was propagating ideology across realities, using belief as a stabilizing force. The collapse was not merely physical. It was cultural, philosophical, and psychological. Palpatine took notice. He understood belief better than any ruler in galactic history. Fear, hope, devotion, all were tools. If belief shaped reality, then controlling belief meant controlling the collapse. The Emperor ordered discreet observation of the Harmonists, resisting the urge to annihilate them outright. They represented a proof of concept. If ideology could stabilize convergence zones, it could also destabilize rivals. The Sith philosophy, refined and weaponized, might do more than dominate the galaxy. It might overwrite existence itself. Thrawn, however, saw danger where Palpatine saw opportunity. He argued that ideology-based stabilization was inherently unstable. Belief fractured under stress. Cultures evolved. What unified today could shatter tomorrow, triggering collapse at unprecedented scale. Thrawn advocated a hybrid approach, combining scientific modeling with controlled socio-political influence, minimizing reliance on any single variable. The Emperor listened, but did not commit. He rarely did. The Mandalorians made their choice without hesitation. Recognizing that no external authority could be trusted, they formed a defensive compact with other warrior cultures pulled from different realities. Their fleets patrolled convergence-adjacent systems, enforcing strict neutrality through overwhelming force. They did not seek to control the collapse, only to survive it. Their armor incorporated adaptive materials capable of recalibrating at the molecular level in response to shifting physical laws. Where others feared unpredictability, Mandalorians engineered against it. This adaptation did not go unnoticed. Imperial scouts reported Mandalorian vessels operating effectively in regions deemed non-navigable by standard models. Rebel agents attempted covert negotiations, hoping to secure alliance or technology. Both efforts failed. The Mandalorians had learned a harsh lesson from the collapse. Dependence invited extinction. Their loyalty was to their people alone. As these power shifts unfolded, the convergent structures advanced toward completion. Their geometric alignment grew more precise, forming a lattice spanning entire sectors. Energy flowed along invisible channels, bending light and distorting gravity. Sensors recorded harmonic oscillations across dimensions, suggesting synchronization. Whatever was being built was nearing activation. The galaxy had entered the final phase, whether it knew it or not. The Jedi reached a consensus they had long avoided. They could no longer remain observers. The Force itself was changing, reshaped by countless realities intersecting. If they did nothing, the Sith, the Empire, or something far worse would define its new form. The Jedi began preparing a risky initiative, one that would require cooperation with unlikely allies and acceptance of doctrines they had once rejected outright. Balance, they realized, might no longer mean equilibrium between light and dark. It might mean synthesis. As the galaxy braced for what came next, alliances shifted, ideologies hardened, and the very concept of reality stood on the brink of redefinition. The collapse was no longer a distant catastrophe. It was a mirror, reflecting the choices of every being within it, and it was waiting to see which path the galaxy would take. The lattice revealed itself fully only when it was already too late to ignore. Entire hyperspace routes vanished overnight, replaced by corridors of warp starlight where navigation computers returned contradictory readings. Fleets attempting emergency jumps emerged light years from their intended destinations, some intact, others torn apart as if reality itself had rejected their presence. The galaxy was no longer merely unstable. It was reorganizing. At the heart of this transformation lay the lattice, an immense structure of intersecting convergence points stretching across multiple sectors. It did not exist in a single location, but rather as a distributed phenomenon, its presence inferred through synchronized distortions in gravity, time, and the Force. Scientists described it as a framework upon which a new, unified reality was being assembled. Jedi described it differently, sensing something akin to intention woven into its design, as if the galaxy itself were attempting to reconcile incompatible histories. The first undeniable proof came from Coruscant. Without warning, a section of the Ecumenopolis phased out of alignment. Entire districts flickered between architectural styles, some familiar, others utterly alien. Towers reshaped themselves mid-structure, materials shifting from durasteel to substances no imperial database could identify. For several minutes, multiple versions of Coruscant overlapped, streets populated by echoes of civilizations that had never existed in this galaxy. Then the city stabilized, leaving behind scars that no reconstruction effort could erase. The Emperor sealed the affected zones immediately. Imperial propaganda declared the incident contained, attributing it to a localized hyperspace accident. Privately, Palpatine convened his inner circle and authorized contingency protocols long considered theoretical. The possibility that the capital itself might not survive the unification forced even him to reconsider assumptions. Control required continuity, and continuity could no longer be guaranteed. Thrawn proposed evacuation strategies. Not full abandonment, but decentralization. Secondary capitals, mobile command structures, and distributed governance. The Emperor rejected most of these recommendations. Fragmentation bred weakness. Yet he allowed one concession. A shadow command was established beyond known convergence vectors, tasked with preserving imperial doctrine should Coruscant fall. Even Palpatine prepared for outcomes he did not intend to accept. Across the galaxy, similar realizations took hold. The Rebel Alliance abandoned several long-held bases, not due to Imperial pressure, but because the worlds themselves were becoming unreliable. Supply caches vanished. Atmospheres altered composition. On one jungle moon, gravity reversed polarity for several hours, sending vegetation and structures drifting into the upper atmosphere before crashing back down. Survivors spoke of hearing voices during the event, fragments of languages none recognized. These phenomena forced the rebels to adapt their tactics. Rather than fixed installations, they adopted nomadic command structures, coordinating through encrypted bursts transmitted during brief windows of stability. The pilots trained to fly without full reliance on instrumentation, learning to feel distortions through subtle cues in their craft. What had begun as a fight against tyranny evolved into a struggle against an environment that no longer obeyed consistent rules. The Jedi Order felt the changes most profoundly. Meditation no longer produced uniform visions. Where once the Force flowed like a vast current, it now resembled a braided river, streams intersecting and diverging unpredictably. Jedi Masters attempting long-range perception encountered overlapping futures, contradictory yet equally real. Some saw a galaxy unified under a benevolent synthesis. Others saw annihilation. A few saw something worse, survival stripped of identity. Debate within the Order reached a breaking point. One faction argued that the Jedi must actively guide the unification, shaping it toward harmony. Another insisted intervention risked imposing their flawed understanding on a process beyond comprehension. The old doctrine of detachment offered no guidance for a universe demanding choice. Inaction, they realized, was itself a decision, one that ceded agency to others. A decisive moment came when a convergence wave struck a remote Jedi enclave. The enclave did not collapse. Instead, it transformed. The force within its walls intensified, not violently, but coherently. Jedi present reported heightened clarity, an expansion of perception that allowed them to sense multiple realities simultaneously without fragmentation. This state did not corrupt them, nor did it overwhelm. It integrated. The enclave became a living proof that synthesis was possible without destruction. News of this spread quickly, despite attempts at secrecy. Palpatine dismissed the reports as Jedi delusion until Imperial probes confirmed anomalous stability at the site. Unlike other convergence zones, this one did not expand chaotically. It harmonized. The implication was staggering. If the Force could act as a stabilizing medium, then Force-sensitive intervention was not merely possible but essential. Control of such sites became a priority for every major faction. The Sith acted first. An elite task force descended upon a similar convergence region, attempting to replicate the Jedi phenomenon through domination rather than harmony. They imposed ritualized order, channeling dark side energies to force alignment. For a brief moment, it worked. The region stabilized under their control. Then it collapsed catastrophically, consuming the entire force and leaving behind a void where sensors detected nothing at all. Not emptiness, but absence. The message was unmistakable. The collapse could not be coerced. This failure did not deter Palpatine. It refined his approach. He began exploring subtler methods of influence, manipulating populations rather than raw energy. If belief shaped reality, then shaping belief at scale could achieve what brute force could not. Imperial messaging shifted tone, emphasizing unity, destiny, and inevitable order. The Emperor no longer presented himself merely as ruler, but as custodian of existence itself. The Harmonists responded. They amplified their activities, staging mass gatherings near convergence zones. Millions attended, drawn by promises of transcendence. These events produced measurable stabilization effects, though fragile and short-lived. Intelligence agencies infiltrated the movement, uncovering a decentralized structure resistant to decapitation. There was no leader to eliminate, no headquarters to destroy. The ideology propagated organically, reinforced by shared experiences across realities. The rebels faced an impossible dilemma. Disrupting these gatherings risked destabilizing regions further, allowing them to continue ceded influence to a movement with goals fundamentally incompatible with individual freedom. Some rebel cells chose sabotage anyway, leading to violent clashes that fractured entire systems. Others attempted dialogue, only to find harmonist beliefs immune to conventional argument. They did not seek power. They sought dissolution. Amid this chaos, unexpected alliances formed. Independent traders, former Imperials, exiled Force sensitives, and even remnants of fallen civilizations began coordinating outside traditional power structures. They shared data, resources, and insights, prioritizing survival over ideology. These networks proved surprisingly effective, navigating unstable space with adaptive strategies unconstrained by doctrine. In many ways, they embodied the synthesis the galaxy struggled to achieve. The Mandalorians expanded their defensive perimeter. Their patrols now included vessels of foreign design, crews drawn from multiple realities. Honor codes evolved to accommodate difference without erasure. They did not claim to understand the collapse, only to endure it. In doing so, they demonstrated a pragmatic path forward that neither resisted nor surrendered, but adapted relentlessly. As the lattice neared full activation, time itself began to misbehave. Historical records altered retroactively. Events once considered fixed shifted subtly, memories adjusting to match new timelines. Individuals experienced déjà vu not as fleeting sensation, but as sustained awareness, recalling lives they had never lived. The past was no longer immutable. It was negotiable. This realization shook the Jedi deeply. If history could change, then so could prophecy. So could destiny. The Force was not guiding the galaxy toward a predetermined outcome. It was responding, moment by moment, to collective action. The future was open, terrifyingly so. For the first time in generations, the Jedi understood that balance was not a state to be preserved, but a process to be continually chosen. As convergence waves intensified, a final truth emerged. The multiverse was not collapsing into the Star Wars galaxy by accident. It was converging here because this galaxy, shaped by constant struggle between light and dark, order and chaos, had developed a unique resilience. It was a crucible capable of containing contradiction without immediate annihilation. Whether it would survive the test remained uncertain. But one thing was clear. The next phase would not be decided by armies alone, nor by singular rulers. It would be defined by the choices of countless beings acting under unprecedented pressure, each contributing to the shape of whatever reality came next. The first true war of the unified reality did not begin with a declaration. It began with a disagreement over rescue coordinates. A convoy of refugee ships fleeing a destabilizing system transmitted distress signals across multiple frequencies, their messages fractured by temporal interference. According to Imperial navicomputers, the convoy existed in 3 different positions simultaneously. Rebel scouts confirmed 2 of those readings. Independent traders reported a 4th. Each faction plotted a different rescue route, and each was convinced the others were wrong. When fleets arrived, all coordinates proved correct. The system had fractured into overlapping spatial layers, each partially occupying the same stellar volume. Star destroyers emerged alongside rebel corvettes, Mandalorian frigates, and vessels of unfamiliar design that none could identify. For a moment, they simply stared at one another across distorted space, weapons armed but uncertain. Then the layers began to drift. Gravity inverted in one layer and intensified in another. Time lagged unevenly, causing some ships to move in stuttering frames, while others slid forward in unnerving smoothness. Communications desynchronized, orders arriving before they were sent. Amid the confusion, a refugee transport collided with a convergence shear and disintegrated, its destruction rippling outward as a shockwave of causality. That shockwave ignited the war. Imperial captains, trained to interpret chaos as threat, opened fire on anything not broadcasting authorized codes. Rebel pilots reacted instinctively, defending vulnerable transports. Mandalorian crews engaged any vessel that endangered civilians, allegiance irrelevant. The unidentified ships joined the fray with weapons that bent light and silence alike. Within minutes, the system became a battlefield spanning multiple realities, each engagement governed by different physical laws. What followed could not be recorded accurately. Sensor logs contradicted eyewitness accounts. Battle footage showed starfighters dodging projectiles that did not exist moments later. Some vessels sustained catastrophic damage only to appear intact seconds afterward, as if causality itself were undecided. The force surged unpredictably, amplifying reflexes in some pilots, while muting it entirely in others. Jedi present described the battle as disorienting beyond words. They could sense intent, but not outcome. Every choice branched into multiple consequences, all equally real until observed. Several Jedi attempted large-scale force interventions to stabilize the space-time lattice, only to find their efforts redirected into unintended effects. One master slowed time around a collapsing transport, saving its passengers, but in doing so accelerated entropy elsewhere, causing a nearby moon to fracture. The battle ended not through victory, but exhaustion. As convergence forces peaked, the overlapping layers snapped back into partial alignment. Ships vanished from scanners, not destroyed, but displaced into unknown strata of reality. When the system stabilized hours later, wreckage drifted silently among survivors who no longer knew how many they had lost or saved. The aftermath reshaped galactic politics overnight. The Emperor declared the incident an act of multiversal terrorism, blaming rebel interference and unauthorized actors. Rebel leadership countered with evidence of imperial aggression. Independent systems issued their own condemnations, citing reckless militarization of unstable space. None of these narratives captured the truth, but all were weaponized. More importantly, fear replaced speculation. The galaxy now understood that large-scale conflict could trigger catastrophic convergence effects. War was no longer merely destructive. It was destabilizing at a cosmological level. Yet this realization did not bring peace. It changed the calculus of power. The Empire adapted first. Palpatine authorized the creation of reality suppression zones, regions saturated with technology and force-dampening fields designed to reduce convergence volatility. These zones were brutally effective, but exacted a cost. Within them, force sensitivity diminished, hyperspace travel slowed, and populations reported emotional numbness. Order was maintained by flattening existence itself. The Emperor accepted this trade without hesitation. He framed the zones as sanctuaries, places where citizens could live without fear of reality collapse. Many welcomed the stability, unaware of what they were surrendering. Others resisted quietly, sensing that survival without agency was another form of annihilation. The rebels fractured over how to respond. Some cells argued for targeting suppression infrastructure, believing freedom meaningless if existence was constrained by tyranny. Others warned that destabilizing these zones could trigger mass casualty events. Debate turned bitter, old alliances strained by incompatible priorities. The war against the Empire became secondary to arguments over how much reality itself could be compromised in pursuit of victory. The Jedi found themselves caught between these extremes. They recognized that suppression zones prevented catastrophic convergence, but violated the natural flow of the Force. The lattice responded poorly to enforced uniformity. While local stability increased, long-term strain accumulated at the boundaries, creating pressure points that threatened even greater collapse. A council conclave was convened on a neutral world untouched by suppression fields. For the first time in generations, Jedi from disparate philosophies attended openly, joined by Force sensitives unaffiliated with the Order. They shared experiences, insights, and failures. Patterns emerged. Stability arose not from dominance or erasure, but from integration. Regions where cultures, technologies, and beliefs interacted organically adapted better to convergence than those enforcing singular doctrine. This conclusion was dangerous. It implied that the Empire's strategy, while effective short-term, would ultimately worsen the collapse. It also challenged rebel assumptions about dismantling authority without providing alternative cohesion. Most unsettling of all, it suggested that the Jedi themselves, with their rigid codes, might be contributing to instability. Change was inevitable. A faction within the Jedi proposed a radical shift. Rather than acting as enforcers or guardians, they would become facilitators, embedding themselves within diverse communities to guide adaptation rather than impose balance. They would teach awareness of the Force without demanding adherence to Jedi orthodoxy. It was a rejection of centuries of tradition. The proposal split the order. Those who supported it departed quietly, forming mobile enclaves that traveled between convergent zones. They did not advertise themselves as Jedi. They listened, learned, and intervened sparingly. Over time, regions they visited showed measurable increases in resilience, not immunity, but adaptability. The Sith took notice. Palpatine observed these developments with calculated interest. While he dismissed their philosophy, he recognized their effectiveness. If adaptation could not be crushed, it could be exploited. He began positioning agents to infiltrate these enclaves, seeking to redirect their influence toward imperial ends. At the same time, new players emerged. Beings from collapsed realities, once minor figures in their own universes, now found themselves empowered by the convergence. Their abilities functioned erratically, but creatively within the lattice. Some became warlords, others healers, others scholars obsessed with understanding the collapse. None fit neatly into existing categories. One such figure altered the trajectory of the war. Appearing simultaneously on multiple worlds, this individual transmitted a simple message across open channels. The collapse was not inevitable. It was a negotiation. Reality responded to collective intent. Conflict amplified divergence. Cooperation reduced strain. Survival depended not on victory, but on coherence. The message was dismissed publicly by every major faction. Privately, intelligence agencies scrambled to identify its source. They failed. The transmission did not originate from a ship, planet, or known dimension. It appeared as a resonance event, encoded directly into subspace fluctuations. The galaxy had spoken to itself. The lines of the coming confrontation became clear. This would not be a war for territory alone. It would be a struggle over how existence itself should function. Suppression versus integration. Control versus adaptation. Fear versus trust. Every faction, every individual would be forced to choose not just sides, but principles. And the lattice was watching. The galaxy did not collapse all at once. It learned. In the wake of the convergence battles and the rise of suppression zones, reality began to exhibit something resembling memory. Regions that had experienced extreme instability started reacting preemptively to conflict, tightening or loosening their physical laws in response to intent before weapons were ever fired. Hyperspace lanes subtly rerouted themselves. Force currents thickened around sites of cooperation and thinned where domination was attempted. It was as if the unified galaxy had begun developing instincts. Most beings did not notice at first. Traders complained about longer routes. Pilots blamed navicomputer errors. Force sensitives reported fluctuations they struggled to articulate. But the pattern became undeniable when entire skirmishes failed to occur, not because diplomacy prevailed, but because the battlefield itself refused to form. On the border of a suppression zone near the Outer Rim, an Imperial task force prepared to pacify a world accused of harboring convergence enclaves. The order was routine. Troops mobilized, orbital cannons aligned, atmospheric insertion vectors calculated. Yet, as the fleet advanced, sensors began returning contradictory data. The planet appeared closer than it should have been, then farther away. Targeting solutions dissolved into mathematical impossibilities. When the first turbolaser test fired, the bolt curved gently and dissipated into harmless light. The Admiral ordered a retreat. The official report cited anomalous interference. The Emperor read deeper. He recognized resistance, not from rebels or Jedi, but from the lattice itself. Reality was no longer passive. It was responding. Palpatine did not fear this development. He welcomed it. To him, a responsive reality meant leverage. If existence could be conditioned, it could be trained. The Emperor intensified experiments within the deepest suppression zones, combining Sith alchemy, ancient Force rituals, and convergence mathematics recovered from collapsed systems. Entire populations were relocated without explanation. Worlds went silent. The goal was singular: imprint dominance onto the lattice. If reality adapted, it would adapt to power. Meanwhile, beyond imperial reach, the galaxy began to change in quieter, more unsettling ways. On a backwater world once ignored by every major power, a settlement of refugees from dozens of realities began exhibiting shared perceptual shifts. Children dreamed the same dreams despite never meeting. Architects designed buildings that stabilized local spacetime without understanding how. Farmers sensed when storms would destabilize gravity days before instruments detected anomalies. None of this was taught. It emerged organically, shaped by necessity and cooperation. The roaming Jedi enclaves observed these developments closely. They did not intervene directly. Instead, they asked questions, recorded behaviors, and shared insights between worlds. Over time, a philosophy began to take shape, one that did not treat the Force as a mystical energy to be wielded, but as a language spoken between consciousness and reality. The Force, they realized, was not causing adaptation. It was translating it. This insight terrified the traditionalists. If the Force was merely an interface, then it did not belong exclusively to Jedi or Sith. Anyone capable of awareness, intent, and restraint could influence the lattice. Power was no longer gated by lineage or training alone. It was distributed. The Sith saw this as dilution. Within the Empire, dissent grew among dark side acolytes who felt their supremacy threatened. Some defected. Others pursued forbidden methods to amplify their dominance, pushing themselves beyond physical limits. A few succeeded, becoming monstrous focal points where the lattice warped violently around them. These individuals became weapons, unstable, devastating, and short-lived. The rebels faced their own reckoning. Cells operating independently found that uncoordinated strikes caused localized instability, endangering civilians they sought to protect. Success now required coherence across vast distances and ideologies. To adapt, the rebellion began experimenting with decentralized consensus protocols, sharing intent and strategy in real time through hybrid Force technology networks. It worked imperfectly. Operations guided by shared purpose rather than rigid command structures showed higher success rates and lower collateral damage. Fighters reported an uncanny sense of alignment, knowing when to advance or withdraw without explicit orders. Skeptics dismissed it as coincidence. Veterans knew better. Something fundamental had shifted. The galaxy was beginning to act like a single organism. This terrified the Emperor more than any rebellion. Unity was dangerous. Unity could not be controlled easily. Suppression zones slowed this development, but could not stop it entirely. At their boundaries, strain intensified. Entire star systems became pressure points, flickering between stability and collapse. One such system became the flashpoint of Section 8. Located near the galactic core, it housed an ancient structure predating known civilizations, a lattice anchor, long dormant, now reactivating. Whoever controlled it could influence convergence dynamics across vast regions. The Empire moved first, establishing a massive blockade. Rebel forces followed, unwilling to allow total domination. Independent fleets arrived soon after, drawn by rumors and desperation. The standoff lasted days. No one fired. Each faction sensed that the first act of aggression would destabilize the anchor, possibly triggering a chain collapse. Tension built not through threats, but through restraint. Negotiations began reluctantly, then in earnest. Representatives, who would never have shared a room, now debated survival strategies. Jedi facilitators were invited, not as leaders, but as interpreters. They helped articulate what many already sensed. The anchor responded not to authority, but to alignment. Control would not come from claiming it, but from agreeing on its purpose. This concept enraged hardliners on every side. Power shared was power lost. Yet reality itself enforced the truth. When an Imperial commander attempted to seize the structure covertly, the anchor destabilized only around his forces, isolating them in a pocket of slow time. They were recovered days later, unharmed but shaken, having experienced mere minutes. The message was unmistakable. Force without coherence was rejection. The Emperor withdrew the fleet. Officially, it was a tactical redeployment. In truth, Palpatine recognized a variable he could not yet dominate. He turned inward, accelerating his ultimate contingency. If the galaxy was becoming a unified entity, then he would become its singular will. Elsewhere, hope flickered dangerously. The anchor system became neutral ground, governed by a fragile coalition. It was not peaceful, but it functioned. Trade resumed. Refugees arrived. Knowledge flowed. The lattice stabilized locally, reinforcing itself through cooperation. It was proof that survival without tyranny was possible. And that proof spread. The galaxy stood at a precipice not of destruction, but transformation. War was no longer inevitable, but neither was peace. The old rules had failed. New ones were emerging, written not by emperors or councils, but by collective choice. The Force flowed differently now, less like a current to be ridden, more like a mirror reflecting intent. Every action mattered, every conflict echoed, and somewhere deep within the suppression zones, the Emperor prepared to make reality remember his name. The final fracture did not announce itself with explosions or alarms. It began as silence. Across the galaxy, hyperspace traffic slowed almost imperceptibly. Not halted, just delayed, as if the medium itself were hesitating. Force sensitives experienced a pressure behind their thoughts, not pain, but insistence. Dreams grew sharper. Meditation became difficult. The lattice was no longer merely responding. It was converging toward a decision point. The Emperor initiated his contingency, deep within the largest suppression zone ever constructed. Hidden beyond navigational impossibility and layered illusion, Palpatine activated the culmination of decades of preparation. This was not a superweapon in the traditional sense. There was no beam, no planet-killing discharge. Instead, it was a resonator, a throne world apparatus designed to impose singular intent onto the lattice itself. If the galaxy had become an organism, this would be its brainstem. The device fed on dominance, conflict, fear, and obedience, harvesting them not from populations alone, but from the Force signatures of entire star systems. Suppression zones flared to life in synchronized alignment, forming a vast geometric pattern that overlaid hyperspace itself. Routes collapsed. Signals died. Entire sectors fell out of causal sequence, trapped in repeating moments or accelerated decay. The Emperor did not seek to destroy the galaxy. He sought to finalize it. Within the Imperial hierarchy, panic erupted. Even loyal Moffs realized this was no longer governance. It was annihilation by stasis. Worlds under Imperial protection screamed for aid that could not arrive. Admirals attempted to disengage fleets, only to find their ships locked in space-time eddies that mirrored their own indecision. The rebels were hit hardest. Their decentralized networks, once an advantage, became vulnerable as shared intent amplified the lattice shockwaves. Entire cells lost contact simultaneously. Coordinated strikes dissolved into isolated survival efforts. For the first time since the collapse, despair spread faster than hope. Yet the galaxy did not submit. Something unexpected occurred at the edge of the suppression network. The lattice resisted synchronization. The Emperor's imprint met friction, not from opposition, but from contradiction. The countless choices made across the galaxy, the fragile coalitions, the anchor systems built on alignment rather than domination, all introduced noise into the pattern. Reality refused singularity. The lattice anchor near the core reacted violently. Instead of stabilizing, It began broadcasting, a ripple of coherence expanding outward, countering suppression not with force, but with resonance. Worlds connected to the anchor felt clarity. Force sensitives regained focus. Hyperspace routes reasserted themselves along improbable but navigable paths. The galaxy was splitting, not into factions, but into philosophies. Palpatine sensed the threat immediately. This was not rebellion. This was rejection. He diverted power, overloading suppression nodes to crush the resonance before it could propagate further. Several zones collapsed catastrophically, tearing systems apart. Billions vanished in silent flashes of unbeing. The lattice screamed. That scream echoed everywhere. Jedi enclaves broke cover. Rebel fleets regrouped. Neutral worlds armed themselves not for conquest, but for defense of coherence. Even criminal syndicates recognized the danger. A galaxy frozen under one will meant no profit, no chaos, no future. For the first time in history, an alignment formed not against an enemy, but against an outcome. The assault on the suppression nexus was not planned by any single faction. It emerged organically as fleets followed the same improbable hyperspace corridors, guided by shared intuition rather than command. Jedi ships flew alongside smugglers. Mandalorian clans guarded refugee convoys. Rebel fighters coordinated with planetary defense forces that once feared them. There was no banner, only intent. As the Armada approached the heart of the suppression zone, reality fought back. Physics degraded. Time stretched. Weapons malfunctioned unpredictably. Force abilities surged and vanished without warning. Victory could not be achieved through overwhelming power. Only precision, restraint, and coherence allowed progress. Within the Nexus, Palpatine stood alone. The Emperor had anticipated opposition, but not this. He felt the lattice resisting his imprint, not violently, but persistently. Like sand grinding against a machine. His power was vast, but it was singular, and singularity no longer fit. He adapted. Drawing on ancient Sith knowledge, Palpatine began consuming the suppression zones themselves, collapsing them inward to reinforce his connection. Systems died to fuel his ascension. The Emperor transcended physical limitation, becoming a focal anomaly where dark intent condensed into near divinity. From his perspective, he was succeeding. From the galaxies, he was becoming irrelevant. The anchor resonance intensified, harmonizing disparate wills into something unprecedented. Not a hive mind, not obedience, a shared refusal. The force flowed around the Emperor instead of through him. His lightning scorched nothing but void. His commands echoed unanswered. The climactic confrontation was not a duel. There were no chosen champions. Instead, the Armada reached the Nexus and did not fire. They stabilized. Ships formed precise geometric formations, reinforcing the anchor signal. Jedi meditated in open space, not to attack, but to listen. Millions across the galaxy aligned their intent, not toward victory, but toward continuity. Survival without domination. Order without tyranny. The lattice responded. The Emperor's imprint fractured. Not shattered, peeled away. Palpatine screamed as his singular will was rejected by a reality that no longer required it. His form destabilized, stretched across moments and possibilities, unable to anchor itself. With one final act of spite, he attempted to drag the Nexus down with him. Reality denied him. The suppression zones collapsed inward, consuming the Emperor's presence and sealing the fracture. There was no explosion, no confirmation of death, only absence. The galaxy exhaled. In the aftermath, systems reappeared altered but intact. Hyperspace stabilized into new configurations. The force settled, not calm, but balanced differently than before. The Empire fractured instantly, leaderless and exposed. Some regions descended into chaos. Others transitioned into self-governance overnight. The rebels did not claim victory. There was no throne to seize. The galaxy had survived singularity. Now it had to learn how to live without it. The galaxy did not rebuild itself with ceremony. There was no universal proclamation marking the end of the crisis, no galactic holiday to commemorate survival. Instead, recovery unfolded unevenly, quietly, shaped by choice rather than decree. Worlds awoke to altered star maps, rerouted hyperspace lanes, and political realities that no longer obeyed the old center-periphery logic of empire and rebellion. The multiverse collapse had not simply threatened existence. It had rewritten the assumptions that once defined power, distance, and destiny. In the absence of the emperor, the imperial structure unraveled with alarming speed. Moffs and admirals discovered that fear alone could not hold territories together when hyperspace itself no longer obeyed rigid control. Some attempted to rule independently, declaring localized empires fortified by remnants of suppression technology. These regimes rarely lasted. Without the lattice enforcing dominance, coercion became expensive, fragile, and unstable. Populations that had endured years of oppression sensed weakness immediately. Revolts were swift, often bloodless, driven less by ideology and more by exhaustion. Other imperial leaders chose a different path. They negotiated. Systems once ruled through star destroyers transitioned into defensive coalitions, trading obedience for protection agreements. Former officers became administrators. Stormtrooper garrisons were restructured into planetary security forces. The empire did not vanish. It dissolved, fragmenting into successor states that varied wildly in morality and effectiveness. History would argue for generations over whether this outcome was justice or merely transformation. The Rebel Alliance faced its own reckoning. For decades, rebellion had been defined by opposition. Now the axis of that opposition was gone. Mon Mothma and other surviving leaders resisted the temptation to declare a new central authority. The galaxy had just rejected singularity at a fundamental level. To replace one throne with another would invite the same fate. Instead, the rebels facilitated something unprecedented, a networked republic without a capital. Representation was local. Coordination was voluntary. Defense was mutual, not compulsory. Some systems joined eagerly, seeing hope in autonomy without isolation. Others remained independent, wary of any structure that resembled the past. The result was messy, inefficient, and often frustrating. It was also resilient. No single failure could collapse it. The Jedi Order emerged from the crisis, changed more profoundly than any faction. During the collapse, Jedi across the galaxy had felt the Force behave in ways their teachings had never prepared them for. It had rejected dominance, punished rigidity, and rewarded adaptability. The old dogma, detachment, strict hierarchy, centralized authority, felt suddenly insufficient, even dangerous. Survivors gathered not in grand temples, but in small conclaves scattered across systems touched by the anchor resonance. Debate was fierce. Some argued the Jedi had been right all along, that the chaos proved the need for strict discipline. Others countered that the Order's inflexibility had contributed to the Emperor's rise and nearly to reality's collapse. No single interpretation prevailed. Instead, the Jedi fractured by philosophy rather than allegiance. New traditions formed. Some Jedi embraced deep integration with local cultures, serving as mediators rather than generals. Others withdrew entirely, becoming Force scholars dedicated to understanding the lattice's altered nature. A few pursued paths once forbidden, studying emotional resonance, collective alignment, and non-binary interpretations of the Force. The Jedi were no longer an order. They were a spectrum. Across the galaxy, ordinary beings felt the change most intimately. The Force, once distant or mythic to many, now manifested subtly in daily life. Not as telekinesis or visions, but as heightened intuition, shared emotional surges during moments of crisis, and an uncanny sense of when cooperation mattered more than competition. Children born after the collapse displayed sensitivity patterns that defied old classifications. Some were powerful, others gentle, many simply aware. Force sensitivity was no longer rare. It was contextual. This terrified some worlds and liberated others. Cultures that had once persecuted sensitives re-examined their fears. Criminal syndicates attempted to exploit the shift, recruiting those with heightened perception for smuggling and espionage. Mandalorian clans tested new armor designs that responded not to the Force itself, but to intent, seeking balance between tradition and adaptation. The galaxy diversified at an accelerating rate, and through it all, the lattice remained. It no longer sought convergence. Instead, it behaved like a living archive, responding to alignment rather than authority. Systems that cooperated found hyperspace routes clearer, resources more accessible, and stability easier to maintain. Those that pursued domination encountered friction, logistical failures, internal dissent, and environmental collapse. Reality itself had developed preferences. No one fully understood whether the Emperor was truly gone. Some Jedi sensed echoes, residual imprints drifting through null space, stripped of agency but not entirely erased. Others believed the lattice had absorbed him, converting singular will into distributed caution. Sith cultists emerged sporadically, attempting to recreate dominance through ritual and technology, but their efforts failed to scale. Power hoarded collapsed inward. Power shared persisted. The Sith, as an ideology, struggled to survive in a galaxy that rejected singular ascent. Yet darkness did not disappear. It changed form. Conflict remained. Worlds still fought over resources. Betrayal still occurred. Heroes still fell. But no single war threatened to consume everything at once. The galaxy had learned, at catastrophic cost, that total control was indistinguishable from annihilation. Years later, historians would mark the collapse not as an ending, but as a threshold. Before, the galaxy had been shaped by empires, chosen ones, and centralized destinies. After, it became defined by convergence without conformity. Countless stories unfolded simultaneously, intersecting and diverging without requiring permission from a throne or prophecy. Legends shifted accordingly. The most celebrated figures of the new era were not conquerors or saviors, but anchors, beings and worlds that held communities together during moments of fracture. Their names varied by region. Their deeds rarely involved battles. They were remembered for refusing dominance when it was offered, for choosing alignment over victory. In the deepest reaches of space, remnants of other universes lingered as anomalies, pocket realities stabilized by the lattice, no longer expanding, but not erased. Scholars debated whether these were scars or seeds. Explorers mapped them cautiously, aware that the galaxy's survival depended not on expansion, but on restraint. The Force flowed through it all, not as a weapon or doctrine, but as context. A reminder that connection mattered more than control, and that existence itself resisted being owned. The multiverse had collapsed into one galaxy, and that galaxy had learned to say no. The galaxy did not return to what it had been. It could not. When the final fracture sealed and the last echoes of collapsing realities faded into silence, the Force flowed differently. Not broken, not corrupted, changed. It carried memories now of worlds that had burned under different stars, of heroes who had never sworn oaths to the Jedi, of tyrants who had never known the Sith. The Force had absorbed the multiverse, and in doing so, it had become something larger than prophecy ever allowed. Across the stars, the consequences settled in quiet ways. A Mandalorian forge burned with unfamiliar runes that answered to no kyber crystal. A Jedi youngling dreamed of battles, fought with fists instead of sabers. A Sith Lord felt doubt for the first time, sensing that domination was no longer the only path to power. The galaxy had gained new myths, and lost the comfort of believing it was alone. At the center of it all, balance did not mean peace. It meant coexistence. Gods walked beside soldiers. Legends stood shoulder to shoulder with scoundrels. The light no longer claimed moral purity, and the dark no longer held a monopoly on ambition. Choice mattered more than alignment. The multiverse was gone, but its spirit endured, folded into a single living galaxy that would never again be small, simple, or predictable. The Force had always bound all things together. Now, it remembered everything it had ever touched.